You start entering data in the application, and then you press save, and then lo and behold, a couple of moments later, you get an error message saying you forgot to enter something, or this is in the wrong format. This is where client-side validation can really help you out. It's great that we do it on the server. I mean, that's where data integrity is upheld, but we also want to do it on the client side for that user experience. So in this module, we're going to add that to our application. We're going to talk about different types of client-side validation and how we can apply them in a SPA. We'll choose a good approach and then show how we can use the Breeze validation directives to make it pretty easy in our application to apply validation and show the user what they need to do to correct it. Now, some of the validation that we get out of Breeze is free, so we don't really have to write any JavaScript to get it. And we'll show what you get for free out of the box, and then how you can create your own custom validation rules as well. And then we'll demonstrate how you can configure the validation options and then also style them differently according to the UX of your application. And by the end of this module, you'll know how to apply validation to your Angular and Breeze application. There are several ways that we can tackle validation, and it all depends on what you want to achieve. So let's start off with focusing on the goal of validation. So my mantra for validation has been that you want to make sure the validation is done on the server all the time, without exception, and you do it on the server for data integrity. Somebody could always bypass your client, so you want to make sure the server has that validation. But you also want to have validation on the client for user experience. Nobody wants to make a bunch of mistakes on the client and then have to wait to be told feedback on what they did wrong. And now we're going to focus on the client-side experience or validation in this module, but remember, it is always crucial that you validate on the server as well. So when we focus on client-side validation, I'd like to zero in right on the client-side user experience. For example, if we're typing in an email field, we want to make sure we give them feedback right away on what they did that they have to correct. Or you'll notice here we've also got red asterisks next to the required fields. Now, how you style and choose your paradigm for notifying the user, that's completely up to you. But the important part is to make sure that you let them know right away. And as I mentioned, there's a couple of schools of thought on how to do client-side validation. The two we're going to focus on here are view-level versus model-level validation. And the best way to describe these two is to ask yourself some questions. With view-level validation, you got to ask yourself if you want to copy the business rules to all the different places in the HTML that you display and surface those properties. And the way I like to lean is at model-level validation, which means that the model should drive the UI and that validation experience. So let's go a little deeper into each one of these. When you're doing HTML5 validation, you're doing view-level validation. You're going to have a lot of attributes inside all of your views and their tags and elements. You might put in regular expressions or required attributes or a variety of custom validation. After all, HTML5 supports all this. But you're going to still have some custom rules that you're going to have to code in JavaScript too. No big deal. We all have custom rules. You'll provide a good user experience to the user, but now the view has awareness of how to validate. Is this a bad approach or good approach? No, it's just an approach, and you need to weigh the pros and cons here. You're going to have a lot of great experience, but now you're making sure that all of your awareness of how to do validation is in that client view. Let's look at an example here. Let's say we've got a model of a customer. Now we could have a view for showing customers or a controller that's got customer information or a service that modifies customers. Now all that information gets sent up to all these different places, maybe at different times. If we have HTML5 validation, we could stick attributes in the view for view A to make sure that the customer information is a required field or meets a certain criteria. We could also do that in view B, so now we've copied it from one place to the other. But what happens if we change that information in a controller? Do we have any validation there? Well, no, we don't have HTML5 validation there. And what if a service changes it? None there either. So the whole key here is, depending upon where we change that model information, using HTML5 validation is not going to catch it all. It's only going to catch it at the user inputs inside the HTML. So we could miss a place. Model validation takes that same structure and says, you know what? We have all these different services and controllers, and we're still going to propagate those properties everywhere. But now, let's put the validation in the model. So no matter who uses that information, we'll always be validating it. Now you might be wondering, okay, so you're talking about the validation pieces, but what about the display of the validation to the user in the views? We still need that, right? Yes, absolutely. So the way that we're going to handle that is to use a directive or another attribute inside of our HTML to show the model of a validation, but we're going to make it simpler than HTML5 validation. So let me explain. Out of the box, Breeze is going to validate all of our properties on the model, and we can use Breeze's zValidate directive to help surface those validation messages to the user. which means that anytime there's a change to any property, we're automatically going to validate that model property. And in the HTML, with a single attribute, we can display the information to the user about what the validation problem is. And the key here is that we're going to be able to separate out how you calculate the validation error from how you display it. The how you calculate it is going to be in your models, and then how you display it is only going to appear in the HTML. So we're going to end up getting that validation whether the property is displayed or not. It could be in a service, could be in a controller, or a view. So we'll be using model level validation, and let's go add that to our code. We want to make validation easier, so we're going to pull in some helpers from Breeze. If we head out to the breezejs.com website and then you click on the download link, down on the bottom left we can see an area called Breeze Labs. Now in there's a directives.validation.js. If we click on that, it'll describe to us the way that the validation is going to work using this helper. And they even have a sample right here. So for example, we could say, let's blank out this field Tracy, and now we're going to get a required field of first name is required. Let's say we've got a phone number that's invalid. I could put in there John. Well, that's not a valid phone number. So it's going to do validation for us with regular expressions and basically whatever rules we come up with. So we want to take advantage of these features. So let's close the browser and we'll go back to our project and we'll pull down a NuGet package that pulls in the Breeze Labs for this validation. So we'll type in install package. And the name of the package is breeze.angular.directives. Now you might get a message in here saying it already exists in the project, you want to overwrite it. If you do get that, then you want to hit the A for yes to all. Hot Towel actually pulls this down for you, but you want to make sure you get the most recent version of this file, so you want to make sure you overwrite it. If you didn't get this message, no worries, just go ahead and pull it in. So now that we have that file, let's take a look and see what it actually added. Down in the scripts folder, we can see that we've got this Breeze validation. We open that up and you can see version 132 happens to be the current version, and you'll see it creates a module called breeze.directives. Well, that should be a trigger to you right there that we need to add that to our project. So let's do that. If we go back up into the app.js, now we can see that we've got these custom modules and third-party modules. We want to add one for Breeze here. So we're going to say make sure it's dependent upon this Breeze directives module. So that'll make sure that it loads this module before it loads our app module. And then inside the index.html, we want to make sure we've got both the CSS for the validation and the JavaScript in here. Now it added into our project this content Breeze directive CSS. That's how we get the automatic styling by default for the validation messages. And then we also want to make sure that we have down at the bottom our Breeze validation JS file. And that should be located in our vendor scripts right here. And if you don't have those, make sure you add them in, otherwise your project won't be loading them. And that's all we need to do to pull them into the project. Now that we've pulled Breeze into our project for our validation, let's take a look at how it's going to examine the metadata to give us this user experience. If we provide Breeze through the metadata that it retrieves from the server, information about validation such as required fields or max length, like we're showing right here on our server-side data models, Breeze will get those from the metadata and then use those to provide free validation without writing any code on the client. Which is cool if you think about it. So now anytime we have a required field, like the title for a session, it's automatically going to validate that for us. In fact, it's actually been validating that all along. We just haven't been displaying it on the screen. So what else can we get from that model level validation? Well, once we start lighting up these features and showing them on the screen, we're going to be able to see that if we have like a blank session here, we just press the new session button, we'll show information to the user about the things that didn't pass validation. And here we can see we've got the title is required, and then we have some other validation that we're going to add along the way for how the drop-down lists need to select a room or a track. And the way this gets surfaced on the screen is through the Z validate directive. So let's take a look at what we get. Well, obviously we get all the messages here like inconceivable, a title is required. And then we also get these required flag indicators for all the required fields. We can pop up a message to the user showing them all the validation errors in one place. They don't have to scan the entire screen for them as well. And to get there, we just add these little attributes inside of each of the elements that need to be validated. Now notice we're not telling the HTML how we're going to validate. We're just telling it that Breeze will handle it for us. So we're not having to put into here, this one's a required field, this one uses this custom validation, that one uses a regular expression. We just say, this one has validation, please enforce it. Let's take a closer look at that Breeze directive. So we get some HTML and we just say, all right, here's the property that we're going to validate, and then Breeze will inspect that property through the Z validate directive. So we're just going to tell Breeze to validate it and display any message and surface it to the user. And by adding this simple directive, now we can have different things like required fields or max length, or maybe we have a regular expression in there for an email. And we haven't added any JavaScript yet, we're just doing this through the directive. So let's go surface these messages in our application. I mentioned that Breeze is going to give us some validation right out of the box, so let's go enable some of that here and make it show up in the views. So we'll go into the session detail view, and then over here in the title, we know this is a required field, but we're not going to stick something in like required. Instead, we're going to stick in our directive, this data-z validate. So now, if there happens to be any validation rules for this session title in the model, Breeze will go ahead and display it on the screen for us if we don't pass the validation. Now we know that this one happens to be required and has a max length. There's also some other required fields in the speaker detail. Let's go apply those as well. Now I happen to know that the first name and last name are required, so we'll stick in the z-validate directive there. And then let's save those. Now remember, the only JavaScript we really had to add was to make sure in app.js that we had the Breeze directives module as a dependency. So let's run the application. We'll open the developer tools and we'll refresh just to make sure we're not caching any JavaScript. Now let's go over to the speakers and we'll choose Aaron Sconard. And let's remove his name. Boom, right there. We can see that we've got the first name is required. All right, that's good. Well, let's type in a new name here instead. We'll call him Fred. Notice the message goes away. We also have our required field indicators right here. Well, let's blank it out again. Now the last name is also required, so we should be able to blank that out, and boom, we have the same problem here. So for now, let's cancel these, and we'll go over to the sessions, and we'll try out our validation there. So now let's go into the keynote, and again, we see required flag, and let's just remove the title. It's telling us the title is required. Great. What if we type in a really long title? Because if you recall, this has a max length of 50 characters. And let's just copy and paste this. And once we exceed 50 characters, it's saying, all right, well, it's got to be 50 characters or less. Now you say, what happens if we try to save here? Well, we press save, and now Breeze is going to tell us, well, you've got the same issue down here. So it's not only catching it up in the element, but it's also going to catch it when we press save. Well, let's cancel this and see if that works for speakers. We'll flip back over here. We'll go into Brad Green this time. Let's remove both his first name and last name and press save. Notice that we're getting both the first name is required and the last name is required. Both of them get caught inside the toast. So this is just an example of how we get some validation for free. Often we're going to want to add custom validation rules to an application. In our app, when we have a track, we want to make sure that an actual track is selected. So JavaScript, that's cool, but select a track, that's not a valid track. For this, we're going to write a little bit of custom validation. And the first step in creating custom validation is to create the validator that we're going to need to apply to our properties. So here's a little bit of code for an example where we're naming the validator require reference entity. We want to make sure we actually have an entity associated in that drop-down list. And then for our context, we're going to pass into Breeze, we're going to put two key pieces of information in here. One is a message template. This is what's going to display when there's a problem. And here we're going to say missing and then display name surrounded by the percent signs. That's going to be a replacement for the name of the field that's actually missing. So it would say like missing room or missing track. And we're also adding in the is required flag because we want the little dot to appear next to the field, that little asterisk. Then we can create this validator. So we say new validator, and that's a Breeze validator. And we'll pass in the name and the context, and that middle parameter is the validator function. So here is where you put your custom logic for what do you actually want this thing to do. In our case, I'm going to say, great, you got a value? Let's just make sure that value has an ID that's not 0, because 0 is the select a track or select a room. If not, then it's not going to pass. And if there is no value because it's actually blank or null in that object, then we're also going to not let it pass with false. Now we just defined the rule once, and once we define the rule, then we register it with Breeze. That's as simple as saying validator.register. And now that Breeze is aware of it, now we can apply it to entities and their properties. So for example here, we're going to say go get the entity for session, and on there there's a property called room, and we're going to apply this reference validator to that property. And by using this pattern, you can create any validation rule that you like. When I create custom validation, I like to create a validation service that handles it all, just to keep it all in one place. I could put it in the model, but instead let's go into the services and we'll add a new file. Let's add a new Angular factory, and we'll call this model validation. We'll first name the service ID, model validation. And before we forget, we'll go add model validation to the index.html. We'll put that down towards the bottom. Here we have the model.js. Let's drag that in right after it. There we can see it. Now we'll save and go back to model validation, and let's fill in our service. And now let's name our service model validation up here and make the function point to it. And the only thing we're going to rely on is going to be the common module, which is pretty common. Now let's first create a method to expose so people can create and register our validators. So we'll just call that create and register. And when people call this, we're going to want to pass in the list of all the entities that we have. Now we've already got that inside the model right here. So now we can just pass those in. So let's create a variable up top so we can know what those are, because that'll be handy. And then we'll pass them in here, calling it eNames. And the first thing we'll do is set the entity names equal to that. Now the first validator we're going to create is this require reference validator. So we'll create that guy, and we'll call a method called create this require reference validator. So now he's going to be a variable we're going to create up top. And then we've got this function over here that we're going to have to refactor and create. So we'll come down here now. We'll create that function. So step one is to create it. And step two is we're going to tell Breeze about it. And for this, we're simply going to say validator.register. And then we're going to pass in the validator name. So once we create it, we'll have it and we'll tell Breeze about it. Now, validator is not a valid variable name. Actually, what we need to do is we're going to create a shortcut, because we're going to use validator a couple times, to the Breeze validator. That's just going to save us from typing Breeze dot. And then step three is, well, later on, we'll apply it. And I'll get back to what this means exactly too. But first things first, we need to create our reference validator. So we'll give it a name, and then we're going to create that context. And the context is going to have information in it like, what kind of display name do we want to show if there's an error message. So here we've got our message template, and we've got this is required, which will set the flag with a little asterisk next to the field. Next, we need our validator function. So let's create that now. And we're going to have to pass into this the value. So this will be the value of the room or the track or the time slot. And for here, we'll use that same syntax we just saw on the slides. If we have a value, great, check it, and then make sure the ID is not equal to 0. Otherwise, we'll return false. And once we have all of these, now we can create the validator. So we'll create this local variable called val. We'll spin up a new validator object, and we're going to pass in the name, require reference entity. Then we'll pass in the val function, and finally we'll pass in the context. And of course, once we're done, we'll return this. So now our function will create this require reference validator, return it back to this variable, and then register it with Breeze. Just to make sure we've got a little bit of debugging as we go, let's add a logging function here right after we create it and tell Breeze about it. So we're going to log out that the validators were created and registered from this service. Because we're using the logger, that's why we have common up here, we're going to go ahead and pull in the logger function. There's a couple things left to do. First, we've created this great function, create and register, but somebody has to call it. So we'll do that from model. And then we're going to need to apply the validator to the different properties and the entities that we want it to apply to, such as tracks and rooms and time slots. And finally, we'll have to add the zValidate directive to the select elements in the HTML, so Breeze knows where to display the messages when there is a validation error. So first things first, let's go back to model. And when model is configuring the metadata store, that's an early on point. Let's go ahead and after we register these different entities, we'll say model validation, create and register, and we'll pass in those entity names. Now, of course, we need to make this a dependency for model, and we don't have one yet, so let's add one right here. So we'll look for model validation, and we'll pass that in. So now when we create the metadata store, we're going to create and register these validators. The next step is we're going to have to apply them. So back inside of here, we're going to want to create a method called apply validators. And we'll need the metadata store to do this. And the first step is to apply the require reference validators. And then we'd apply any other validators we want. And we'll log out a message for now, just to let me know that the validators have been applied. So how do we apply the reference validators? Well, this is where we take the validator after we've created it and registered it, and now we associate it with the properties on the entities. So let's be smart about how we apply this, because we've got 4 places we want to do it. After all, we have 4 drop-down lists on that one screen. We've got the rooms, the tracks, the time slots, and the speaker. So let's try to be a little bit dry here. I know that these navigation properties on this session object are all called room, track, time slot, and speaker. Let's create an array of those. Now we have the property names. Let's go ahead and get the entity. And for that, we're going to use a function that Breeze exposes called getEntityType. And to do that, we're going to get it by its name. Luckily, we already have the names in this one property we created earlier. And now that we know the entity and the navigation properties, let's go ahead and loop through them. Now for each one of these, we're going to apply the validator. So first, we'll go into the entity type. We'll go ahead and get its property by the property name, which will be room, track, time slot, or speaker. And then we want to get onto the validator's property. And that's going to be an array that Breeze tracks for us, and we're going to push into this our validator. This is going to be the require reference validator. So now we have some pretty simple code to loop through all the different properties on the session and then associate and apply that reference validator, each one of them. So now somebody has to call this method. Now we've already exposed this from here as apply validators. We'll apply this particular one for now. We could add more later. And over a model, is anybody calling it? Well, not yet. Now we're just applying validators here, but you could extend the metadata in some other way as well. So let's expose a method from the model called extend metadata, just doing a little bit of forward thinking. Now let's go ahead and create that method here. And all he's going to do for now is call the model validation and call the apply validators. And he'll pass in the metadata store. So this is great. We set up all the validation and we have a way to activate it. Now we just have to do that. So the guy who's going to be in control of all this is the data context. And the time to do that is in the prime method, because that's one of the first things that runs. And already inside of prime, we have this extend metadata local function. And we already have a handle on the metadata store. So let's go ahead and just call in here model.extend metadata. And we'll pass in our metadata store. So following the bouncing ball, that's going to come into here on prime. It's going to get the metadata store and then go off and call extend metadata in the model, which in turn is going to call the apply validators. And then it'll come back here and continue on. And this code down here was for setting up our registering of our resources. So because I don't like long functions, let's go ahead and just optimize this a little bit. First, we'll close off that function and we'll create a new one here. It's going to be called register resource names. And then we'll just call that. Now that we've set up all the validation, let's go and put the validation directives over inside of our view. So inside of session detail HTML, we should have a couple places where you have a select. And I can just search for those. So down here we can put in data-z-validate. And we'll do for all 4 selects. We did tracks, we did time slots, here's the rooms, and then down a little bit further, we've got our speakers. So just to recap here, inside of data context, in the prime method, which runs right as the app starts to crank up, we're going to extend our metadata. What does that do? Well, model extend metadata just in turn calls the apply validators in model validation. We'll come up here. It's already created and registered all these before that. Now we're going to apply them. And then we're going to come back into the data context. We're going to finish up everything that prime needed to do. And then it's going to run. So when we run the application and we go to session detail, we should now have validation logic on that page. Let's go ahead and open up the developer tools. We'll refresh to clear out any cache. Now let's go into the sessions page. We'll click into a keynote. Now you can see the required fields are showing up. That's good. What happens if we select a track? That says select a track. Now we have a validation mistake. So let's do it a couple times here. All 4 of these could be missing. And notice the messages relate directly to the property name. Missing speaker, room, time slot, or track. And now if we press save, we're also going to see the message down here. Now that we know how to apply validation, let's take it a step further and look at our session details page. Here we've got the required fields, and validation works there for requireds, but what about email and blog and Twitter? We want to make sure that we have good values here, so let's go create some validators for these and apply them. Back in the world of model.validation, that's where we're going to take care of this. So let's apply the validators for Twitter, email, and a URL. Now wait a second, we haven't actually created these validators yet, right? Well, for Twitter, we certainly don't have one yet, so let's comment that one out. But for email and URL, We already have validators that Breeze gives us out of the box to help us with these. So we don't actually have to create the email validators or register them. They're already registered with Breeze. So let's create this function here to apply the validator. We have to tell it which fields to put it on. And we'll copy a little code that we used earlier in our other apply. We're going to need to go get the entity. And the entity this time is not going to be the session. Instead, it's going to be our speaker. And again, we'll take some code from our other apply function to help us actually push the validator onto the property for that entity. Now, what's the property name going to be in this case? Well, we're doing it for the email address, so that's going to be the property called email. And it happens to be on the speaker entity, which we just retrieved right there. And we're not going to apply the require reference validator. Instead, we're going to use one of the ones that comes out of the box with Breeze. So if you go to validator, and you look at email address, you'll see it right here. And that's actually a function. And that's all we have to do to apply the email validator just to the email property on the speaker. So let's do the same kind of thing with apply URLs. And we'll do a little copy and paste magic here. It's going to be pretty similar. Again, it's going to be on the same speaker entity. But this time, the name of the property is not email. It's actually going to be blog. And we don't want to apply the email address rule. Instead, we're going to apply the one for URLs. Now, we're not so lucky with the Twitter one. So for that, we're actually going to have to create and register our own validator for it. So let's go ahead and create a new function down here. We'll call it the create Twitter validator. So this will be our local variable for the validator. And we'll use the validator object and use its make regular expression validator function. So, oh joy, we get to do regular expressions. First, we have to give it a name. That's the easy part. I'll do that. Now, you come up with the regular expression that you like. Okay, I'll give you a hand. Next, we'll put in the message that we're going to display. We'll say, okay, this is an invalid Twitter username. And then we'll replace that with the value. And that's going to be our validator, so we'll just return that. So who's going to call this guy? Well, we've got this function up here called create and register. So right after we create the require reference validator, let's call this one. And we'll create a variable for that up top. Now that we've created him, we have to tell Breeze about it. So we'll copy step 2 there. And this time, we're just going to register that validator. So now we've created the Twitter validator, we've registered it, and then later on, we're going to need to apply it. So now we have to have our apply Twitter validators. So let's go ahead and copy the email ones. Do a little copy paste magic here. We're going to get the entity for speaker. The property that we're going to apply this to is going to be Twitter. And we're not going to use the validator.email address. We're going to push on the Twitter validator. So now we can remove our to-do. So this is one of the cool parts about Breeze with validation is that when we create and register these guys, you only have to create and register ones that are custom. So we didn't have a Twitter one or a require reference one, so we created those and registered them with Breeze. But we did have some email and URL ones that we could just take advantage of. So we applied those to the properties that we needed to, and then we also, in the same place, we applied our own custom ones. Now, there's one last step we have to do. We actually have to go decorate inside of our speaker detail HTML the different elements that we want to validate. So notice before we already did first name and last name with data z validate. Now we want to also do email. And we also want to do blog. And we're going to do Twitter. And notice that we don't have to tell it what kind of validation to do. We're just saying, hey, you know, there's some validation associated with this property. Please make sure that you validate it for us. And all that validation is stored inside of the model validation service. So now let's run it and test it out. And we'll open up the developer tools and refresh. Now let's go over to speakers. We'll pick your favorite speaker. We'll do random ones down here. We'll come up. Now again, we've got the required fields. They're good. And if I type in an invalid email here, like invalid, or just invalid at, it's going to say that's not good. But I could say invalid at foo.com. And now we're okay. Same thing with the blog here. And we've also got something for the Twitter. So we can just type in here, yo. So these are not going to be valid values. And if we hit save, we're also getting those same messages down here. This is just another way that you can create validation. Let's say in our application that when we add a new session, we don't actually want to see all the validation mistakes just as we're adding a new one, because that's kind of like, whoa, right in my face. I mean, once we start entering them in and we press save, maybe that's good, or as we're typing them, but maybe not right away. So Breeze has an option where we can actually make this a little bit more user-friendly. And the ideal place to be setting our options for Breeze in here could be the Entity Manager factory that we created earlier on in the course. Here's where we told it, okay, we're going to use camel casing naming conventions. So in here, we'll do a little bit to say, let's go into Breeze and we'll go into the validation options. And one of the options that we can pass in through this object literal is validate on attach. And I'm going to set this to false. And then I'm going to tell it that's going to be the default. So what's this going to do for us? Well, this is going to tell Breeze whether or not we want to validate when we attach a new entity on the Entity Manager. So when we go create a new session, we may not want to validate right away. And in this case, I really don't want to. So when we attach it to the Entity Manager, that new session, it's not going to validate right away. It'll wait till we do like a save or something else. And that's not the default behavior as we just saw, so this is going to override that. Let's go ahead and run it and see if it kicks in. We'll open up the developer tools and refresh. We'll go back into the session. Let's click add. And notice now we don't have all the validation mistakes. However, we start typing in here. Let's go ahead and select the track. That's good. Let's unselect it. Now it's going to tell us, wait, you can't do that. And if we click on save, they're all going to appear. So we're still safeguarding everything. We're just not going to put it right in the user's face right up front. You don't have to do this, but I find it's nice to be able to configure it the way you want in your application. Let's say that we wanted to customize our messages to look a little bit different, maybe even just style them different colors or put icons next to these. We can do that too. And for that, Breeze exposes to Angular a provider called Directives Config. Let's go set that up. So let's close everything we have here, and we'll go inside of the config, and we'll go back down to the bottom. We've already set up a couple other config providers, so let's go ahead and add one here for the Breeze directive. So to do this, we're going to go inside the module and go to app config, and the name of the provider is going to be Z Directives Config Provider. So now during configuration phase of the application, Angular will go find this provider, and then we can set it up. And it's going to be defined as this inline function. And our config provider will have a property on here called validate template. We can set that template to be anything we want. So it already was basically just a span with the class invalid applied to it. So we can just take that and we can tack some other things onto it. Let's say I wanted to actually put a warning sign icon into it using our fonts from Font Awesome. So I could type in, all right, let's create this class, and it's going to be icon warning sign. And we'll put the word in inconceivable. We have an error. And we close out our span. So now Breeze is going to replace the validation template that it uses with this one here. So let's go ahead and run the app. And we'll go ahead and clear out the cache. Now we go inside of sessions. We'll select a session here. And we'll choose the select a time slot. Now we can see there's our icon. It says inconceivable, missing time slot. Now I just adjusted the icon and put a phrase from Princess Bride in front of it. But you could replace the entire styling of this too if you wanted to. Use different HTML elements, call different CSS classes, do whatever you like. It's totally up to you. It's just another optional customization point that you can use. In this module, we talked about the different types of client validation. We specifically focused on view-level validation and model-level validation, and why we're using model-level validation inside of our app, so we make sure that we're validating whether the properties are actually on a screen or not. And then we showed how we can use the Breeze Z Validate directive with Angular apps to surface those validation messages in the views. And Breeze gives us some validation for free, which is awesome. We don't have to write any JavaScript. We just get required fields and anything else it can glean off of the data annotations. And then we can add our own custom validation, whether it's something that's a totally custom rule like our Twitter validator, or something out of the box like the URLs. And finally, we can configure it to do things like validating on attach or not, and then also style it with the custom config provider. And all these customization points between Angular and Breeze really make it easy for you to add validation however you need it in your app.